Night falls over the Middle East. Sirens wail somewhere beyond the horizon. Missiles streak across a darkened sky. Bright and violent flashes swallowed by the dark. Cities below, cities that have known the weight of conflict for generations, braced once again beneath the roar of modern warfare. To most people watching the headlines today, the hostility between Israel and Iran seems like something recent. Something born in the last decade, maybe two. A crisis of the modern world: drones, sanctions, cyber warfare, nuclear negotiations. But the truth is far more complicated than the headlines suggest. Because this conflict did not begin with missiles. It began decades ago with a revolution and a profound ideological clash that would redraw the map. To understand how Israel and Iran became bitter rivals, we first have to travel back to a time when these two nations were not enemies. In fact, for many years, they were quiet partners. Welcome to Foregone Chronicles. Unlikely partners, the early alliance. The year is 1948. A new nation has just been born, carved out of land and conflict. Israel declares independence, and almost immediately, it finds itself surrounded by hostility. Neighboring Arab states refuse to recognize its existence. Wars break out across the Middle East. Iran, then ruled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was positioning itself as a modern force in regional politics. The Shah had a vision. Iran as a strong, modernized state, aligned with Western interests, a beacon of progress in a turbulent region. And in that complicated environment, something unexpected happened. Israel and Iran looked at each other and found common ground. Both nations feared the rise of Arab nationalism. Movements in Egypt and Syria threatened the stability that both Israel and Iran depended on. So, quietly, away from public attention, Israel and Iran began building something rare in that corner of the world. A relationship. Oil flowed from Iranian fields to Israeli cities. Israeli experts traveled to Iran, helping with modernization and agricultural development projects. Intelligence agencies, behind closed doors, shared information and coordinated on matters of mutual security. The alliance was real. History, as it always does, refused to stay still. And in 1979, it moved with extraordinary force. The revolution that changed everything, minus 1979. To understand this, you must understand how powerful the Iranian Revolution truly was. Millions of ordinary Iranians took to the streets. The Shah, once considered untouchable, found his authority crumbling beneath the weight of popular fury. The Shah fled, and into the vacuum stepped Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious scholar who rejected the Shah's pro-Western vision entirely. Khomeini called Israel the Little Satan, positioning it as an extension of Western imperial power. Diplomatic ties were severed almost immediately. An alliance built over decades collapsed in months. In its place rose an ideological confrontation that would define the Middle East for half a century. The Islamic Republic was barely 2 years old when a new catastrophe arrived at its doorstep. In September 1980, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein crossed the border into Iran. What followed was one of the longest and most devastating conventional wars of the 20th century. 8 brutal years of trench warfare, chemical weapons, mass casualties, and shattered cities. Estimates suggest over 1 million people died before it was over. For Iran, the war was both a crisis and a crucible. It hardened the revolutionary government and deepened Iran's sense of itself as a nation. And here is where history delivers one of its strangest chapters. Israel quietly watched Saddam Hussein with deep concern of its own. Saddam was a leader with pan-Arab ambitions and a growing military arsenal. A victorious Iraq was potentially more dangerous than a weakened Iran. In a remarkable twist of Cold War geopolitics, Israel made a calculated decision. It provided limited arms transfers to Iran during the war. Not out of friendship, but out of cold, strategic logic. Keep Iran fighting. Keep Iraq from winning too quickly. Realpolitik at its most unsafe. The Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988 with an exhausted ceasefire. In the years following, Iran turned its attention toward a strategy of shadows. The Ring of Fire, Iran's proxy network. To understand Iran's approach, you have to understand the fundamental reality. Iran was isolated. The United States had turned against it, and Arab neighbors viewed the Islamic Republic with suspicion. Western sanctions began squeezing its economy. Rather than fighting directly, Iran built a network, a constellation of allied groups spread across the region, connected by Iranian funding and weapons. Analysts would call this the axis of resistance. Israel called it something more direct, a ring of fire being built around its borders. At the center stood Hezbollah, founded in Lebanon in the early 1980s. It was unlike any militant group the region had seen before. It was a political party, a social services provider, and a military force. It accumulated tens of thousands of rockets pointed toward Israeli cities. In 2006, a full-scale conflict broke out between Israel and Hezbollah. It lasted 34 days, leaving the underlying tension entirely unresolved. But Lebanon was only one front. In Gaza, Iran developed ties with Hamas, providing weapons and funding to groups firing rockets into southern Israel. In Syria, Iran maintained deep ties with the Assad government, creating a geographic corridor stretching all the way to Lebanon. In Yemen, Iran supported the Houthi movement, capable of launching drones toward Israeli territory and disrupting international shipping. Iran constructed a strategic encirclement, a network capable of threatening Israel independently and potentially coordinating together. The nuclear shadow. In the early 21st century, the rivalry acquired a terrifying dimension. Iran's nuclear program moved into the spotlight. Tehran maintained that the program was peaceful, but intelligence agencies reached very different conclusions. The facilities were too hardened and secretive. Israel's position was unambiguous. A nuclear-armed Iran would represent an existential threat, not a political problem, but a matter of survival. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was reached, placing temporary limits on Iran's nuclear activities, but the agreement was fragile. In 2018, the United States withdrew. Iran responded by accelerating its program. The diplomatic architecture began to crack apart. The shadow over the Middle East grew darker, and beneath the surface, a very different kind of war was already underway. There is a particular kind of war that does not make the front pages every day. It has no formal declaration, no uniformed armies marching across recognized borders, no single moment when the world holds its breath. Instead, it moves in silence, in server rooms and intelligence basements, in the holds of cargo ships in the Persian Gulf, in the quiet hours before dawn, when an explosion at a nuclear facility is reported without explanation, and governments say nothing. By the 2010s, Israel and Iran were deep inside this kind of war. Analysts give it a name: the Shadow War. Iranian nuclear scientists began dying under mysterious circumstances. Car bombs, targeted assassinations on the streets of Tehran. 5 scientists connected to Iran's nuclear program were killed in a span of 5 years. Iran blamed Israel. Israel neither confirmed nor denied. Cyber warfare entered the conflict. In 2010, a sophisticated computer virus known as Stuxnet was discovered inside Iran's uranium enrichment facility at Natanz. The malware was engineered to destroy centrifuges while making them appear to function normally. Iran's nuclear progress was set back by months. The operation was widely attributed to a joint American and Israeli effort. The rules of conflict, quietly, had been rewritten. Iran responded in kind. Iranian-linked hackers targeted Israeli infrastructure, financial systems, and water facilities. Cyber attacks struck in both directions. At sea, mysterious explosions struck cargo ships. A covert maritime conflict unfolded across international waters, largely invisible to the public. Neither side declared war. Both sides were already fighting one. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East. In Syria, protests escalated into a full-scale civil war. For Iran, Syria was a vital strategic corridor, the geographic bridge connecting Tehran to Hezbollah and Lebanon. If Assad fell, Iran's entire western axis collapsed. Its weapon supply lines to Hezbollah would be severed. So Iran moved in decisively. Iranian military advisors arrived. Funding flowed. Fighters from Iran-backed militias were deployed to Syrian battlefields. Israel watched with mounting alarm. Iran was using the chaos to establish permanent military infrastructure inside Syria bases and missile facilities. Israel began conducting airstrikes inside Syria, hundreds of them, year after year. targeting weapons convoys in Iranian military operations. The potential for catastrophic miscalculation hung over Syria like a permanent storm. Then, in April 2024, that storm briefly broke open. Iran launched a direct missile and drone attack on Israeli territory. Over 300 projectiles were fired. Israel, with international partners, intercepted the overwhelming majority. Israel responded with a limited strike inside Iran. For a brief, terrifying moment, the shadow war stepped into the open. But the edge was now visible in a way it had never quite been before. At its deepest level, the Israel-Iran rivalry is driven by three forces that do not yield easily to diplomacy. The first is security. Israel sees Iranian influence pressing in from multiple directions: Hezbollah, Hamas, and militias to the east. The second force is ideology. The Iranian Revolution was a declaration of a new political and spiritual order. The third force is regional power. The Middle East is a space of permanent competition for influence, resources, and the shape of the future. Night over the Middle East. Missiles in the sky. Cities holding their breath. The story of how Israel and Iran became enemies is a story about how quickly history can turn. It would be naive to predict reconciliation, but it would be equally naive to declare this rivalry eternal. This has been Foregone Chronicles. Understanding where we are requires knowing how we got here, and that is exactly what we are here for.